This is another video in our series on quadratic equations. In this video we're continuing with the subject of perfect squares quadratic equations. A perfect square quadratic equation is a quadratic equation where the two factors that you multiply together to get your quadratic equation, the two factors are exactly the same. So a plus 5 times a plus 5, or in other words, a plus 5 squared. So that's a perfect square. Okay, so when you multiply these two factors together, you get this quadratic equation. You know it's a quadratic equation because the variable at the beginning is a variable a squared. That makes it a quadratic equation. Okay, the thing to note about this quadratic equation is when it's only in the case of a perfect square is that the number here in the middle of the quadratic equation is 2 times whatever the second term here is, the number in your factor. So the number in your factor, the plus 5, multiply times 2, and you get the center number here in your quadratic equation. So 2 times the 5 gives you 10. And the number on the end of your quadratic equation is this number here, the second part, the second term in your factor is a 5 squared. So 5 squared gives you the 25. All right, so using those two facts, let's do this operation here, which is to make a completed square form of a perfect squares quadratic equation. So if we look at this quadratic equation, and this is a quadratic equation because again, the variable at the beginning of the equation is the variable is squared. So this makes this a quadratic equation. But unlike quadratic equations that you could factor with a puzzle box, there is no third term. You expect an a squared term plus a variable that's not squared in the middle plus a constant. And we're missing the constant term, just a straight number with no variable attached to it. We're missing that. So in order to make a perfect squares quadratic equation, we're going to have to put a number in here. But what number do we need to put in here? Well, having just looked at our first page, we know that if you take half of this number in the middle, take the number in the middle, 8 divided by 2, which gives you 4. If you take that 4 and square it, 4 squared gives you 16. The 16 is the number you're going to need to put in here to make a perfect squares quadratic equation. So we're going to take the 16. The 16 is the number that we're going to add to both sides of the equal sign. You're allowed to add whatever number you want as long as you add it to both sides of the equal sign. So we're going to add 16 on this side and also on this side of the equal sign. So 0 plus 16 gives you 16. Okay, so now we have a quadratic equation in the form that we're used to run through the puzzle box. So the top of the puzzle box, you get this last number, the plus 16. And the bottom of the puzzle box, you get the middle number, plus 8. So what two numbers do you multiply together to get to 16, and you add them together to get to 8? Well, it's a positive 16 and a positive 8. 4 plus 4 is 8, and 4 times 4 is 16. So our two factors are a plus 4 and a plus 4. Now that quadratic equation is equal to 16. And we just factored this quadratic equation and found out the two factors are a plus 4 times a plus 4. So if the quadratic equation was equal to 16, then the two factors have to be equal to 16. And another way to write this would be these two factors are exactly the same, so it's a plus 4 squared, that's what squared means. It means this whole mess here times itself 2 times squared. Notice that the number we got here, the 4, is the number inside the factor. It's the number second term of the factor is the 4. Okay, so let's go to do some classwork problems, just like this example. If you need to come back and watch this example again before you start the classwork problems, do that. Otherwise, have a look at this problem, pause your video, and then we'll compare your answer to my answer. All right, let's look at my answer. Okay, let's try the second one. Same thing over again. Pause the video, and then we'll compare answers. Okay, my answer. And the last problem, same thing over again. Okay, let's compare your answer to my answer. Notice that if you take this number in the middle and you divide by 2, you get the second number inside your factor. This one here, if you take this number in the middle, divide by 2, 2 divided by 2 gives you the second number inside your factor. This works because we're working with perfect squares quadratic equations. Those are the only ones in which the half of the number in the middle is the same number that you get inside your factor. It's because it's a perfect square. And these are the completed square form of a perfect squares quadratic equation. All right, let's try another example. Okay, here's your quadratic equation. You can tell it's a quadratic equation because your variable is being squared. The number in the middle here is a minus 12. What's half of minus 12? Well, minus 12 divided by 2 is minus 6. And if you take the minus 6 and you square it, minus 6 times minus 6, negative times negative is positive, 6 times 6 is 36. So the number we're going to have to add in on this side of the equal sign in order to make a perfect square would be 36. So we add 36 to this side, then we have to add 36 to this side because you're allowed to add whatever you want as long as you add that same number to both sides of the equal sign. So minus 7 plus 36, you have more positives than negatives. You have positive 36, take away 7 gives you positive 29. Okay, so now on this side of the equal sign, we have a quadratic equation that's in the form that we would use for a puzzle box. We can put the number here on the end, to the top of the puzzle box, and the number in the middle, minus 12, to the bottom. So what numbers do you multiply together to get to 36, and you add them together to get to minus 12? Well, if you've got a negative number here on the bottom, then at least one of these two numbers has to be a negative number, because you can't add two positive numbers and get a negative number. So at least one number has to be negative. But if you look up here on the top, you see you've got a positive number. Well, if only one of these two side numbers was negative, and you multiplied them together, you get a negative number on the top. And that's not what we have. So we must have two negative numbers here. And what are those numbers? Well, minus 6 times minus 6. Negative times negative is positive. 6 times 6 is 36. Okay, so the two factors we have, we take this quadratic equation and we turn it into the two factors, a minus 6 times a minus 6. So if our quadratic equation was equal to 29, then that means that our two factors have to be equal to 29 because the two factors are equal to the quadratic equation. We just broke the quadratic equation apart into the two factors. And another way to write this, a minus 6 times a minus 6 is the same thing as a minus 6 being squared. Notice that in our first step here, when we chopped the middle term here in half, negative 12 divided by 2, we got a negative 6. And that negative 6 is the second term, the number inside of the factor for this perfect squares quadratic equation in completed square form. Okay, let's do classwork. This is the same as the one we just did. You need to go back and watch the video for example number 2 over again. But pause your video, do this problem, and then we'll compare answers. Okay, let's look at my answer. Notice that -6 divided by 2 gives you the -3. Okay, pause your video, do the next one. Okay, let's compare answers. And +20 divided by 2 gives you +10. Okay, pause your video again. Complete the square, run it through a puzzle box, and get your completed square form of a perfect squares quadratic equation. Okay, let's compare answers. And -8 divided by 2 is -4. Thank you for watching our video.